Hello and welcome to Collective Basketball Agreements. I'm your host, Joe Manganiello. Excited to be talking WNBA basketball here in the late winter. Almost there for the spring. And that means it's time to discuss WNBA free agency and, essentially sort of capture the status of the offseason. With the way that the WNBA calendar works, the WNBA draft isn't until mid-April, and yet with free agency commencing in the beginning of February, this past 5 weeks, I'm recording here in early March. This episode's going to publish, probably, about a month out from the 2025 draft. And so in some ways, we're midway through the offseason, or most of the way through the offseason. We have a really good sense of what 12 of the 13 WNBA rosters are going to look like this summer. You shout out to the Golden State Valkyries expansion franchise. So exciting to have an expansion team in the WNBA or just in professional basketball in general for the first time in quite a while, since 2008 for the WNBA, even longer for the NBA. So, we're going to see what this first year in Golden State looks like. But today we're actually going to be talking about a franchise that's been around a little longer than that, the Atlanta Dream. And I actually want to get started with an anecdote. So, if you listen to the first episode of the Collective Basketball Agreements podcast, you heard a little bit more on my background in basketball, in the profession of basketball, the industry of basketball. And for me, it's notable that the second WNBA game I ever attended was when I was being hired by the New York Liberty. And so I was invited to Brooklyn. At that time, my partner and I were still living in Philadelphia. We were going to be moving to Brooklyn within days of this game. But my boss at the time, she wanted to invite my partner and I up from Philadelphia and catch a game early in the 2021 season. And so I was joining the Liberty ticket sales department, corporate sales department in their first full season in the in the Barclays Center, rather. So they're debuting in a new borough of New York City. They're actually returning to the five boroughs of New York City after a tumultuous stretch. They were in Westchester County in 2019, 2020. They weren't able to debut at the Barclays Center. And so this was still in the early goings of their first ever season at Barclays. And on the one hand, I had gone to games at Barclays Center coming down from upstate New York, growing up in Syracuse, visiting New York City. Had seen I think my first ever Brooklyn Nets game was on a trip down to New York City in 2013. I was 21 years old. And they played the Paul George Indiana Pacers. And I believe the Nets lost. But it was my first time seeing a WNBA game in that environment. I had seen the Liberty play a game in Newark, New Jersey, actually, years prior to that. That was part of a sports job fair. If anyone who's in the industry or used to be in the industry remembers that, hunting for internships and entry-level positions. And I was in my early 20s, might have even still been at school. I would have to really look back at the dates there. But nonetheless, my second ever WNBA game in person was this game at the Barclays Center. It's on May 29th, 2021. The Atlanta Dream come into town. And the first thing I want to say, and I say this with pride because I was, part of the effort to change this, and my colleagues, my former coworkers and I, in the years subsequent to this, to set all sorts of new records, record growth for ticket sales for the Liberty and helping grow crowds, selling out the Barclays Center, over 19,000 people for WNBA Finals games in 2023. It was such a huge milestone when we finally sold out the entire lower level of the Barclays Center. We were doing that with consistency early in the 2023 season. I want to say that we even got there for a matchup against the Aces in 2022. But here in May of 2021, the Liberty were 5-1 coming into this game. They actually were the better team. Atlanta Dream was 3-2 coming into this game, but the attendance for this game reported 1,235. Again, this is May 2021. Still COVID-19 conditions, and especially in New York City, that was still a very fragile, sensitive moment in the history of New York, as well as the country. But just over 1,200 people for this live sporting event between two competent, enthusiastic, young, up-and-coming WNBA franchises. It was a different time in the business. And so I'm very proud to have, worked in that space for three calendar years, parts of 4 seasons, and, helping the Liberty get to new heights. And we'll never go back to that. We're never gonna go back to those times. But, it would be accurate to say that it was a nadir in many respects. You have an original WNBA franchise and only, 1,200 people coming to this game. My partner and I, we sat in section 24 at the Barclays Center, which those are dream seats for anybody in the market for ticket sales. Go out and, reach out to Ben Keller and KP and Anthony Service and Kendall Brown and Charles Kopf and Joshua Kalu, and make sure you get some tickets. See if you can get in section 24. These days, I don't know if you can. I dare you. But, I was sitting in section 24, looking at this game, blown away by the talent, but I'm also distracted by it, how few people are there. To briefly summarize the game, this is an Atlanta Dream team that looks a lot different than today. To kind of bang out the starting lineup here, Tiana Hawkins, Elizabeth Williams, Tiffany Hayes is on this team. Courtney Williams is on this team. Kennedy Carter is on this team. Odyssey Sims, Monique Billings, Crystal Bradford, Ari McDonald. So these are names that have, in every case, they've moved on to different teams. Atlanta looks a lot different today. We're going to get into that momentarily, but they showed up to play. I mean, this is a Liberty team that has a young Sabrina Ionescu. Benijah Laney is really, the most established veteran talent on the team in a lot of respects. And she played, this game went into overtime. She played 41 minutes. Laney did 12 of 12 from the free throw line, scored 20 points, 11 assists, 6 rebounds, 2 steals. Laney was incredible. Sabrina, didn't have her best game. She was still kind of coming back into form. Remember, she had an injury prior to that she was still coming back from. Sammy Whitcomb, shout out, 19 points, 4 steals, hit 5 threes. Michaela Onyewere, 6 threes, 29 points. That was part of a Rookie of the Year campaign for her early in that rookie season. But the story from this game had to be Courtney Williams. And I think just to wrap this up, I'm still learning about the WNBA at this time. I'd grown up watching so much Division I college basketball, specifically on the men's side, and NBA basketball. And I'm trying to get used to personnel in the WNBA. Watching Courtney Williams, she plays 43 minutes. She scores 14 out of 26 baskets, 3 of 5 from the three-point line. Courtney Williams, 12 rebounds, in addition to 2 steals, 1 block, 7 assists, and 31 points. And she's breaking women off the dribble, getting defenders going each and every way. And I'm thinking to myself, like, Courtney Williams, she's got to be one of the biggest names in the league, one of the stars of the league. And it was fascinating for me to watch her bounce around to different situations. Every year that I worked for the Liberty, she was on a different team, including migrating to Minnesota and really rounding out what was, I think you could argue, the most well-rounded basketball team last season. They ultimately weren't able to beat the Liberty, match the star power of the Liberty, and the Liberty got the job done. But Courtney Williams brought a whole new element and really solidified the guard position for Minnesota in a great way. We'll talk more about that in the Minnesota Lynx episode. But I think, one big picture thought that I have is that someone like Courtney Williams in her career, from the time that she got to the W through this moment in 2021 that I'm spotlighting to today, I think it's painfully obvious that Courtney Williams was an underrated player. I mean, she was just getting buckets however she wanted in this matchup. And in other stops along the way to Minnesota, she was that good too. And I think the WNBA, from my perspective, basketball is a game. It's a 10-foot hoop that stays static. height matters, size matters, strength matters. And I think similar to how the NBA, pre-Steph Curry, there was a very long stretch that now looks painfully obvious where, yes, there's a three-point line, but the unwritten rules of the game, you're not supposed to pull up three with double-digit seconds left on the shot clock. You're not supposed to shoot that three in transition when you can get all the way to the rim. And I think in the WNBA, I think it's taken arguably even longer for the potential perimeter talents to be able to really come out of their comfort zone, take on the agency of, hey, I'm going to play make, I'm going to create shots for myself and others. I'm going to look for three-point shooting opportunities in transition. And I think Courtney Williams maybe she came along a little too early. Like, if Courtney Williams was draft eligible and was coming into the league right now, I mean, in my opinion, she's a no-brainer top 5 pick in your average draft, and someone that you look at, it's like, wow, like at a minimum, she's a game-changing sixth man, microwave scorer off the bench. And I think as Minnesota has found, she's actually more than that. So I just wanted to shout out a few things I remember from that game. The final score there, 90-87. So again, 90-87, yes, it was an overtime game. But, the Liberty, if you recall from that 2021 season, and I was still living in Philly at the time, I watched on TV, Sabrina Ionescu hits a game-winning shot in the home opener for the Liberty. I mean, it's very clear that there's this brand new era of WNBA basketball that is just ready to burst through, where the athletes are so good and so talented and so able with the dribble, with their ability to see the floor through different pick and roll sets, to play an up-tempo, fast-paced game that really emphasizes shooting and playmaking, more so than size, grit, and raw strength. And that's the story of basketball, in any professional league, whether we're talking about the NBA or the WNBA, is this awakening of, what's really possible when you have the dimensions of the floor as they are, the three-point line creating this advantage. It's an entire extra point if you can create a quality look from behind that line instead of shooting from within that line. So wanted to shout out that game. But let's dive in here to the Atlanta Dream. The Atlanta Dream were, let's call it what it is. They were a mediocre team last season in the W. 15-25 record. That was 4th in the Eastern Conference of the WNBA. Now, for those of you who are more used to the NBA side of things, in the W, particularly because there are less teams, the conference standings don't matter directly for playoff seeding. And so Atlanta was ultimately the 8th seed in the playoffs. They played the number 1 seed, New York Liberty. And so how about that? Liberty got their revenge a few years later. They took care of the Dream in the postseason. That was a 2-0 sweep. We're looking at the fundamentals here from the team. Offensive rating of 99, so that's 99 points per 100 possessions. It's 11th out of 12 teams. And this is a team that has offensive talent. We'll get more into that. Defensive rating of 102.5, 6th out of 12. So, they were able to play, competent defense against most opponents, but they weren't scoring enough. That net rating of minus 3.5, that actually was 7th in the WNBA. There were a lot of teams that were struggling and bringing up the rear there. But as we move to the financial fundamentals and talking about this free agency recap, I think it was painfully obvious for Atlanta coming into this offseason. We need to burst things wide open and revolutionize the offensive side of the floor here, because we have a franchise player in Ryan Howard and we have other very talented players who need a chance to really break through. And so, as we look at the financial fundamentals, they have 8 guaranteed contracts now, including 2 fourth-year options that they picked up. Just to run through those players, we're going to talk about Brittany Griner, Brianna Jones, 2 new additions. Those are max salaries of about $214,000 and change. Jordan Canada, Alicia Gray, Nia Coffey, Shatori Walker, Kimbrough. Those are all guaranteed contracts. 4th-year club option picked up for Ryan Howard as well as Naz Hillman. Now, just briefly want to touch on, and I ran through this more detail in the first episode, but I'll say here again, a great collectively bargained policy, that fourth-year club option is guaranteed for the player. And for the team, if you draft well, that means that you don't have to get rid of that guaranteed contract via trade or waiver just because you want to protect other contracts. And so Ryan Howard is a no-brainer, clearly going to pick up that fourth-year option. Even if she can't play, if something tragic were to happen and she misses the season, she's guaranteed that money, a salary just under $92,000. She's, set to be a restricted free agent like so many others in 2026. And so as we continue here, financial fundamentals for unguaranteed contracts. And, right now, no roster spots, 8 + 4 = 12, of course. But as those unguarantees for players like Haley Jones, Maya Caldwell, Holly Winterburn, and they also have a younger player qualifying on the books, ultimately there is some wiggle room at the end of that roster, and we'll see ultimately who makes the team officially by the start of the season coming out of training camp. So, just $145,000 in change in cap space for Atlanta. So, they're mostly set. I mean, we're going to talk about Griner and Jones in a second here. They did their work early. And it's really fascinating to see what they prioritize. Just the last financial fundamental, they have the number 18 pick in this upcoming draft. They do not have a first-round pick. But new coach, Carl Smeshko, he's coming over from college, was running the helm at Florida Gulf Coast. And they had a prolific offense. This was, a college program that from 2019 to 2020 through the 22-23 season, the Eagles led the country in three-pointers attempted and made. And last season, the Eagles, they fell off to second in the country in three-point rate instead of first. But they get shots up, and they were finding a way to play the offensive efficiency game to their advantage. Alternatively, seeing what Atlanta prioritized this offseason by offering max salary slots to Brianna Jones, who I think that reasonable minds can disagree here. When I think of Brianna Jones's game, I think of her best as a center. She was playing with Alyssa Thomas in Connecticut, and so you have such great defensive personnel and such versatile personnel in Connecticut, and you have such an acumen and a reputation for defense. I think there was a way to cooperate. Who's the 4, who's the 5, etc. Brittany Griner is 6'9" and one of the greatest centers in the history of the WNBA. I think it's pretty clear here that Brianna Jones is going to be playing power forward, and that these two players, Griner and Jones, are going to be playing next to each other. I don't know exactly how that's going to work, and I think specifically knowing what head coach Carl Smeshko's forte was with the Eagles, I don't want to say I'm dubious. I am very intrigued, and I think anyone who's a fan of the WNBA and following what the Dream did this offseason, I think we're really all wondering, what is this going to look like? Is Smeshko going to come out and have a brand new way of presenting offense and calling offense and scheming offense that looks so much different than Florida Gulf Coast? And just talking out loud, I think it would make sense to me that he gets his first WNBA job. They have an opportunity to sign two of the most talented free agents in the market, even if they're bigs. Hey, let's get them into our training camp and let's find a way to maximize this team. We're not that far from being an elite defense. They actually had, for a bad team, they had a decent defense last year. So maybe they can get to elite on that end, and it'll make everything easier offensively. Maybe it can lead to more transition opportunities. Atlanta was 11th in pace last year. They played very, very slow. And they were also 11th in three-point percentage. So they weren't playing with pace. They weren't shooting efficiently from the field. And this is despite Ryan Howard being one of the great engines, drivers, athletes with the ball in her hands, perimeter attackers in the league, ultimately being a below average or worse three-point shooting team. Just a very disappointing showing for Atlanta offensively last year. And we're going to see what that looks like with Griner and Brianna Jones as two of the starters. The Dream scored 77 points per game a season ago. That was last in the WNBA. So there was no program in college basketball that embraced three-pointers or layups only as a concept more than Florida Gulf Coast. And Atlanta could really use that. I mean, they could really use a shot in the arm in terms of the most efficient type of shots. We're going to see exactly what that looks like, and ultimately if they can get there this season. But yeah, to put it plainly, I was surprised. I was surprised to see Griner and Jones end up with Atlanta with this new coaching staff. I mean, these two vets have combined for 21 three-pointers over 19 combined seasons in their careers. That's barely one three-pointer between both of them per season. So I'm not sure. I'm just not exactly sure. Now, listening to what players have said in the press, Ryan Howard said after having to defend Brittany Griner in the Unrivaled League and covering Griner on switches, Howard said, quote, "That's a tall task to box out, but getting to use her like the Phantom used her tonight, I'm excited for that. I was trying to get her to Atlanta for a long time," end quote. So I think there's an excitement for Ryan as she continues to establish herself as a superstar in this league. And she has two very, very helpful teammates now with Griner and Jones. Another player that Atlanta added was Shatori Walker-Kimbrough, a guard. I don't have a ton to say here. It was a $150,000 contract guaranteed. Of course, it was a one-year deal. The vast majority of signings this offseason were one-year deals for reasons that we went into in the first episode. The whole league is going to change a year from now when the new CBA is eventually worked out. And so for Shatori, she gets $150,000 guaranteed. Atlanta adds a guard, a competent guard, a career 35% shooter from three, someone who's averaged 2.2 stocks, that's steals and blocks combined, per 36 minutes. In other words, she can be active on the defensive end. She can get into her assignment. So I think having her as someone in the rotation, maybe even someone who can run the offense a little bit, when Ryan's not out there, I think that's a nice pickup. I'm also a huge Alicia Gray fan. Alicia played every single game last year, averaging 33 minutes a game. I would love to see that 1.7 threes per game jump up into the twos. Ryan Howard was at 2.7 threes per game. So, Coach Mesko and his staff they're going to be very excited to work with her and get the most out of her. Jordan Canada is still on this team and is going to figure in quite a bit. To briefly go over, Ryan Howard missed time last year. She injured her ankle on June 21st. Atlanta lost 9 of their next 10 games. And Ryan also shot under 33% on threes. So I think there's a lot to expect when it comes to Ryan being a stronger, more efficient offensive player, healthier. Atlanta hasn't had a winning record since they drafted Ryan. They haven't had a winning record since 2018. So this is a big opportunity for them to get better on that side of the floor. Jordan Canada only played 20 games. And so, as her driving skill set, slotting her next to Howard and then having these bigs to work with, it'll all be very, very fascinating to me. And then, the only other note that I wanted to add here is Tina Charles was on the team last year, but ultimately what we saw was they prioritized 2 other bigs and a different direction for the franchise. Now, I'll stop short of saying a more modern positional approach because, again, they're going to be playing 2 bigs on the floor. We're seeing it work for the Cleveland Cavaliers. Great. They also have Donovan Mitchell and Darius Garland and shooters that they can rotate in and out. We'll see if Atlanta can get to that level. I wouldn't expect them to be the number 1 team in the Eastern Conference the way the Cleveland Cavaliers are this year. But note that Cleveland has gotten incrementally better since they've had that big 4. And, who knows? I mean, maybe Coach Mesko is going to be like a Kenny Atkinson for Atlanta and really revolutionize how they consider the offensive end. We'll talk more about Tina Charles when we get to Connecticut. But I just wanted to note that was a free agent that they lost. And the last thing I'll say about Atlanta, not having a first-round pick this year is a little disappointing just because it's a great draft. And a team like Atlanta, you always want to inject some youth and some future talent into a roster wherever possible. That's not going to happen this time. Although the number 18 pick, I think actually could be pretty strong. Again, this is a great draft, and I think college basketball, every year, there's just more and more talent. So hopefully they can find somebody that they really like with that pick. Ultimately, I'm going to say that Atlanta, their floor as a team is low, relative to the Liberty and the Aces and, now the Fever. And, I don't expect Atlanta to win the championship or be the number one overall seed. I do think they have a ceiling where if you told me that they were locked in on defense from May through September, had a top 3 or 4 defense, were competent on offense, and had that ability some nights to really step up, maybe rise to the level of competition, they earn a playoff spot, and then they just give a team hell in the first round. I think that would be a great outcome for them. Brittany Griner probably would love a little bit more than that. She's a vet that's still, looking to win the big prize, and ultimately, she's still close enough to her prime where you don't want to take any year for granted. But I think it would be unrealistic for Atlanta fans to expect, a title run or even a run to the finals. I think winning a first-round series would be an incredible prize for them. So we'll see what they do with this number 18 pick and how they round out the roster. Very excited for another year of Ryan Howard in the WNBA and to see what Griner and Jones do together in this front court. And with that, we're going to wrap up this free agency recap for the Atlanta Dream. Stay tuned.